Australia and the Sir Zelman Cowen Centre, Victoria University, are delighted to welcome you to its 18th annual Law Week event. Postmortem, what bugs, bruises, blood, bones and teeth tell us about suspicious deaths. But first, on behalf of Sisters in Crime Australia and Victoria University, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose traditional lands we're meeting tonight and pay our respects to their elders past and present. This is the 9th year that Sisters in Crime has partnered with the Sir Zelman Cowen Centre at Victoria University to present its annual Law Week event. Special thanks to Robin Astley and Ahmad Shiva and the wonderful VU team for helping make all this happen. And thanks also to the Victoria Law Foundation for its support. We're thrilled to welcome ABC Radio National, which is recording this event for Big Ideas. This is for the purposes of the video recording. At the end of the session, I will be doing a special thank you to the panellists, but this is not a signal to get up and rush out. We still have more business after that, including the all-important business of the raffle and a few very important announcements by our Sisters in Crime. Now, please welcome our esteemed and expert panel. On my very far left, Professor Linda Iles. On my near left, Dr. Melanie Archer. And in the middle, Dr. Samantha Rowbotham. And just a little housekeeping on how the evening's going to work. So I'll be chatting to our three fantastic panellists for about 55 minutes. We'll then have questions for about 15 minutes, and there will be a prize for the best question as judged by convener Sarah Hood, who's just back from a gap year in Europe. Then the raffle will be drawn, and there are 3 bundles of books to be won, naturally all on the topic of crime. Now, first, I'll just like to more formally introduce our speakers and give you a sense of some of their achievements. Not all, because we would be here all evening, but just a bare outline. So, Associate Professor Linda Iles coordinates the neuropathology program at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. She has worked with the Australian Federal Police in Thailand, Vanuatu, Christchurch and Timor-Leste, and has undertaken medico-legal death investigation work in the Cook Islands, Nauru, the Falkland Islands, and most recently with WHO in Samoa. One of Linda's particular areas of expertise is the brain, and she's one of the specialists in CTE, which is the subject of much controversy in the AFL, as I'm sure you're aware, and other contact sports. Dr. Melanie Archer has been providing forensic entomology services to the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine since 1998, and she is now an adjunct senior lecturer in the Department of Forensic Medicine, Monash University. I have to add that she started out as a forensic entomologist, but in the meantime, in her spare time, trained to become a forensic pathologist. So she has 2 hats really here. So she holds an adjunct research fellow appointment with the Department of Forensic Medicine at Monash University. And I can't find Samantha Rowbotham. Dr. Samantha Rowbotham, I thought I'd lost you there, is the acting service lead human identification service and head forensic anthropologist at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. She also holds an adjunct research fellow appointment with the Department of Forensic Medicine at Monash University. So, now we know who I'm talking to, let's get down to the questions. So firstly, just by way of introduction, I think I speak for most of us and the audience here in saying that we tend to be all interested in what people call CSI moments in forensics. And the CSI moment is that moment when the forensic scientist provides the information that solves a mystery or a crime all on its own. And these CSI moments are basically the bread and butter of all forensic shows. They're the bread and butter of all forensic fiction. And they actually happen to most scientists, if they're lucky, once or twice in a lifetime. But having said that, I think when students are deciding what kind of forensic speciality they're going to follow, or if they're going to follow a speciality at all, they probably learn about cases just like that. So I'm going to ask each of you to tell the story of one of those CSI moment cases relating to your speciality, how you heard about it, and what it ended up meaning to you. So can I start with you, Melanie?
That's a very difficult question. Yeah. I would just like to say that you have a lot of little tiny CSI moments as a forensic practitioner. It doesn't matter what you do, there are lots of little wins that add up to the big win. Mm-hmm. So often you actually don't know a lot about the case that you're working on in terms of the context that surrounds it. You may not know the full story. Maybe the full story is never known. So some of the things that we work on have actually never been solved, and I can think of some things that go back many years that I might have worked on 10 or 15 years ago, and we maybe don't even know the basic information as to who the person even is, let alone what happened to them. So sometimes you do work in a bit of an information vacuum, but for me, it's often those little wins of working out what happened in that particular case in terms of if I'm working as a pathologist, a cause of death, or as an entomologist, something that's factual and I can hang my hat on about a time of death. You know, I might be able to tell the police something that's useful to them in their investigation, and I guess you have lots of little wins along the way instead of one big moment, and sometimes the information that you give people is useful. And I would also just say in relation to entomology, there have been a few famous cases, and some of them, in fact, if you look at them in the modern light, now that we've had 30 years now really of fairly intensive forensic entomology research, some of the big CSI moments, in fact, from the past that we have in the books don't even really stand up to scrutiny anymore. And you look at them and you think, whoa, that's a bit of an overreach, or I wouldn't have said that. and honestly, you know, there are cases where practitioners have given a time of death and they've given it right down to the minute, and it's implicated somebody in a murder, and they're quite proud of that, and they put that in their book, and that was the state of the science at the time, and you read it and you think, oh, I would never say that, because we actually don't even give a time of death. So we give a minimum postmortem interval, and that means that as an entomologist, you're giving the estimate, and it's an estimate, so it has error margins of when the body was first colonised by insects, and that's not always the same thing as the time of death. So there can be a gap between when somebody dies and when the insects arrive. So those people who would give the time of death right down to the minute in the past and solve the case and crack it wide open, sometimes were maybe feeding, maybe unconsciously. I'm not saying that they were being dishonest, but they might have been feeding unconsciously off cues that were given to them by investigators, or the extraneous facts that they knew that have led them to give a very precise answer in those decisions that you might have to make as a practitioner, being sort of guided to narrow things down to where they thought they should be instead of giving them full range. So I guess that's a quite long-winded way of saying that sometimes the best thing you can do as a practitioner is not to have too much of a CSI moment and just be that safe pair of hands and just rely on the evidence as context-free as you possibly can. So that was a boring answer to an interesting question.
I just wonder if you could explain also to the audience exactly what it means to be a forensic entomologist and to study the patterns of arrival of insects.
Yeah, so what it actually means is to be an entomologist first and foremost. And so my approach to it has always been, and this goes for anything forensic that we do, and so when I'm a forensic pathologist, I'm a doctor first and foremost, and always will be exactly that. And I do the forensic application, that's my specialty, but I'm a doctor first and foremost. And as an entomologist, I'm an entomologist and an ecologist first and foremost. I'm a scientist who could be equally comfortable working in a museum or a university environment and just as interested. So that's what it means to me, is to be a really good fundamental scientist who's interested in the entire discipline and just happens to be a kind of applied scientist who works with the courts, just like I could be a kind of applied scientist who works with the agricultural industry or the timber industry. I just apply what I know and what I'm broadly interested in, and I do the science to arrive at applications that are forensic. So that's what it means.
And do you ever surprised by how flies manage to get into an apartment where there is a dead body? Because they are pretty ingenious.
Oh, not just that. Yes, absolutely. There is that. But I've also been surprised sometimes at their ability to dig down, sometimes into coffins with exhumations as well. There are little species of fly that, there is one called the coffin fly, is the common name, which is really well known for digging its way down just through tiny cracks in the soil and can get down quite a few metres. And I've also been quite surprised a couple of times at bodies that are brought up from the ocean, and as soon as they're brought up, even out on the boat, in one case 100 metres out from the shore, was bombed by flies and they laid their eggs on that body. So how amazing they are at actually finding a body and how tenacious they are can sometimes really surprise even somebody who spends a lot of time around them.
A lot of it is about feeding their young, isn't it?
Yes, it's all about feeding their young. And what it boils down to for the flies that colonise bodies first up is finding a resource that they can lay their eggs on, or in some species, actually quite a few common species that we would know, everybody here would have seen, around Melbourne, they actually produce live maggots onto the food source because they actually hatch those internally, and they can squirt live maggots actually onto a feeding resource, which may be a human body, and this gives them a bit of a time advantage so they can start developing earlier. So absolutely, it's all about that. The other reasons that you might see flies at a body, though, which is also kind of about feeding their young, is that they may be there, especially the females, to get a protein meal. And what they're looking for, and so when you get attacked by flies and they're going for your face, or you've got a wound, maybe if you've ever been bleeding and there's been a fly on you and it's trying to get at the blood, and you think, what's it doing? Well, they're actually looking for protein. So they have a physiological urge to search at certain times in their cycle for protein, and they use that protein. This is why mosquitoes bite you. It's only the females that bite you. They're looking for protein. And what they're doing is getting the resources they need to mature a batch of eggs. So they can visit a body for that as well, just to get at the fluids, or they may be there to lay their eggs. Or the males, maybe they're looking for a female, because it's a great place to meet a chick.
Right, so now back to, again, the thing that attracted you to your speciality, Samantha. Was there anything, a particular case that you thought, oh, this is extraordinary, I'll do this?
No, I also didn't have that particular moment. Not that there was ever one case that drew me to forensic anthropology. I think what first drew me was anthropology itself. So in some ways very similar to Mel, the pure science of the original discipline, which in my case is anthropology, and just what you could tell from the human skeleton, whether they died yesterday or they died 2,000 years ago, I think was always a really incredible thing. That someone still had so much story to tell you when sometimes all you had was very little left. So that science of biological anthropology, we call it, and then we just apply it obviously in a medico-legal context, but that science was always, I thought, really quite fascinating. So that principle is what drew me down this path.
And along the way, have you acquired particular skills? Like I recall one of your colleagues, Soren Blau, once had to reconstruct a skull because this was a skull where a woman was dead, but the skull had been damaged to some extent. There were other small pieces of it around, and she'd be a great person to have if you had a craft exercise to do. Managed to pick up all the little pieces, reconstruct the skull, so there was only one tiny little hole left, which was the size of a bullet hole, and it then established that this poor person had actually been shot. If you had to do that kind of three-dimensional jigsaw work?
Yes. So anytime, or not anytime, but most of the time when there's a situation where you've got trauma to a bone, and if you can't understand that trauma without piecing it together, then you have to piece it back together. And it's generally considered best practice that you should piece it back together, even if it's only a couple of fragments or if you've got 200 fragments. So that process is something that we do quite commonly in cases where we're trying to assess for trauma. For those very reasons, if you just have the fragments, it can be very hard to see that an edge of that fragment might indicate that there was a bullet or some type of blunt force event or something else. So you can only really understand what happens when you reconstruct and you're looking at the complete bone again. So jigsaw puzzles are definitely a thing.
For you, but were you good at this before, or you just become good?
I was never an avid jigsaw puzzler as a kid, but I quite enjoy the process because it is quite challenging. Sometimes you can have very little fragments, and it can be quite difficult to piece, which ones go together in terms of anatomically where they sit on a particular bone. So it can be really a challenging process, but it is a very rewarding process.
And so, Linda, again, back to your beginning of your career as a forensic pathologist, was there a case or something that captured your imagination?
Well, the thing that really attracted me to forensic pathology, or more autopsy pathology in particular, is I enjoy medical problem solving. And so my little CSI moments are mostly under the microscope for medical diagnoses. So it's not the kind of exciting things that people see on television, but I actually really, the reason why I do this job and got into this is I enjoy the challenge of finding answers for families and people. That's what I actually get. I mean, the crime stuff, that's part of the job, but actually the things that actually, I won't say bring me joy, it's not quite the right word, but the things that I get excited about is, being able to make a diagnosis which probably wasn't thought of beforehand, and being able to communicate that to families. That's what I enjoy the most. In terms of, I guess, CSI type moments, I think you're right, they're usually very rare, and I'm going to relay one to you, and it's probably fairly disappointing in the scheme of things. But I do remember a case, I went to the scene, and there was a very chaotic scene. This person had become increasingly distressed over the days prior to them being found deceased. It was very chaotic, and this person had some injuries, and there was some smashed glass and things. And one of the big problems that we have is in forensic pathology is not necessarily when looking at cases which are overt homicides, but it's actually working out, is a case a homicide or not? They're some of our biggest challenges. And particularly when you go to chaotic scenes, when people are distressed, they can actually do really quite alarming things to themselves. And sometimes it is a very big challenge for us to work out, or to be able to advise the police, something sinister has happened here, or no, this is just someone who's been very disturbed. Anyway, we really couldn't figure it out in this situation. There was some smashed glass. This lady had a number of injuries, but had clearly been escalating in terms of her distress. So anyway, we got her back and did a scan. And as it happened, the glass at the scene was radiopaque glass, which is relatively unusual. A lot of glass isn't radiopaque. So we could see on the CT that there was glass in this lady's chest. And she had some injuries, which were sharp force injuries. And it was looking more and more concerning, but the police still weren't convinced. And then we did the autopsy and took the pieces of glass out, and then we actually realised that the glass, when you put it together, was one big long shard of glass, and it had smashed. And this lady had no glass, had no sharp injuries to her hand, so she could not have done this to herself. And so it was that bit of fortuitous evidence. We could see this particular type of glass on the CT, and we could put it together to work out that it had been used as a weapon, and she clearly hadn't done it to herself. And subsequently they processed the scene, because the scene was so chaotic from a crime scene investigation point of view. It would have been a nightmare, but subsequently got other evidence to show that that was the case. But those types of things don't happen very often. More often than not, we can say we favour one thing over the other. It's often very hard to be definitive. And I think it's really important to realise that, particularly as forensic pathologists, we only form a very small part of these investigations, and we'll do our work, and we'll often not know what happens outside of the context of what we do. I think, for example, I have never known, apart from my role as a manager in quality control, I have never known the DNA results from trace evidence specimens I've taken in a case. That's not part of what I need to know. And getting back to what Melanie was saying, contextual bias is an issue that we're highly aware of these days. And so what you see on television is people with the forensic pathologist, they know everything and they chase people down the road, etc., etc. But look, in reality, we don't even get to know the DNA results, and that's the way it should be. I'm fine with that, because we really do need to control some of the information that we get, because otherwise you can be misled by bits of information which make you sort of blind you in one particular direction. So we're very conscious of that, and quite often we're in a situation that there's some contextual information that we just need to have, and we need to also be transparent about what contextual information we have and that we've relied on, so that everyone is clear how much is context and how much is a physical observation. Sometimes when we know that there is some contextual information in a case, we might say to the police, we don't want to know that just now. I'm going to do a report, and then after I've done that, you can tell me that information, and if I need to do an additional report with that contextual information taken on board, then you'll have that, but at least it won't bias me to this point in time. So it's something that we're increasingly aware of, and I think the police are also quite aware of it as well, so they're a lot more conscious about how much information they give us.
Mm-hmm. This, as we were saying before, contextual bias is not a concept that is ever relevant in shows like Silent Witness, where the pathologists are out there actually asking questions of suspects, etc. So we can reassure the audience this never happens.
And we're much better looking than the ones on television. So.
Sorry? Yeah. Okay. Along these lines, I wanted to also ask all of you about stories that relating to your speciality that make you kind of cross sometimes. And Mel, I thought you might want to talk about the Sun Tzu case in 1247, which is, if anyone ever reads a book about forensic entomology, for sure it will start with this case. So will you tell?
Oh, please? Yes. So this particular case is often put up as one of the first examples, possibly the first example of forensic entomology, and certainly the first that actually appears in the literature. So this is a very old crime book called The Washing Away of Wrongs, and it speaks of an ad hoc murder trial that was held in a field in China, and there'd been a murder, and somebody came to examine the suspects, and they all had their farm tools, and they were asked to lay them down, and they were all clean to the eye, but the flies settled on one of these tools, and that was given to be because there was trace amounts of blood. It was attracting the flies, therefore that was the murder. murderer. And it just makes me so annoyed that if this actually happened and somebody was convicted on the basis of that, I apologise for my discipline, because we would obviously never do that these days. And you've got to think of alternative explanations, actually. That's one of the strongest things that you as a scientist can do with an open mind, especially if you don't have overlays of context information that box your thinking in early on. And one of the alternatives, for example, it could be a coincidence. It could be that there was a particular pattern on this tool, because actually in the research, if you look at it, there are certain species of flies where people have looked at what particular patterns and colours attract them. And yes, there are dots and stripes and yellow colours that attract certain kinds of flies, and they've looked at this research with a view to making more successful fly traps, actually. But it could have been the look of the thing. It could have been something to do with the wind patterns. So flies like to orient themselves often in ways that are comfortable in terms of the way the wind's blowing, so they'll orient themselves so that they're not getting blown about. Could be something to do with the microclimate where that tool was. Could be what they were cutting. So if they were cutting something like cane that was sweet, well, there are times in a fly's life cycle where I've told you about the protein hunger that they have, but actually their background food is sugary substances. They're often going looking for sugary substances. So if they were cutting cane and that particular sickle had some juice on it, that could be another explanation. Or it could be someone else's blood. It could be the person who owned the thing, if it was blood indeed. So, I can come out with a lot of different explanations, and that's one of the things that I really try to do, is be the first one to think of the alternatives and the caveats on my report, so the limitations that I have. I like to be the first one. I don't want the lawyer to point it out to me when we're in court that, is a bit of a deficiency, or you couldn't really conclude that, could you, because of X, Y, or Z. I would like to give it to them up front so that they've got a chance to lead that out in court, so that it's fair, and I can talk about what I'm sure of and what I'm not sure of, and what the alternative explanations for a certain finding could be.
Mm-hmm. Sam?
So, Liz, I can't think of an exact case in terms of what would make me angry, but in principle, I think the thing that kind of irritates me the most in terms of anthropology is, sort of public perception about how much an anthropologist can actually say, or how definitive the answers are that anthropologists can give. And that's probably a reflection of fiction, because anthropologists are normally very fabulous in fiction at giving exact causes of death and all these sorts of things that does not happen in real life. But the thing is that humans are all unique. Like, every single human is different, and our skeletons are no different to that. So everything an anthropologist does is in many ways an estimation. We can never be 100% definitive. It's always an estimation that this person is biologically male, or this person's ancestors came from the geographical region of Europe, for example. Or if we have a fracture, then we're giving an estimation very broadly saying that fracture might be perimortem. Not that happened at the exact moment that they died, and this is exactly how it happened. That level of interpretation is never possible, and I think that's always been quite a hard thing to communicate to people, is that anthropology can actually sometimes be very limiting in what we can say, simply because humans are just, we're so special because we're unique and varied, and that area has always been the trickiest to sort of explain and communicate.
But yet forensic anthropologists are really important with war crimes investigations, aren't they?
Yes.
And can you tell us why that is, when perhaps that precision of exactly when it happened is not so important, but that it happened?
Yes, well, it would depend a little bit on the context. So sometimes when we talk about forensic anthropology in a humanitarian context, sometimes those questions are relating to identification, and sometimes they might be relating to the circumstances of death, or roughly what happened to that person around the time that they died, which is a relatively key point, that an anthropologist can only ever give you what happened to them around the time that they died, never what happened at the exact moment that they died. And that's for a range of reasons, which I can explain if you'd like, but those two areas tend to be the main areas that anthropologists work in humanitarian contexts. So for identification, the anthropologist will often provide information around estimating that individual's sex, their age, how old they were when they died, their stature, so how tall they were, and their ancestry, so where their ancestors geographically came from in the world. And that information provides a basic biological profile that will help them triage down the identification process, which is quite similar to what we do in a routine domestic coronial context as well. And in cases where they're asked questions around circumstances of death, in those particular settings, that's when we're asking questions around what changes in the bone or what defects in the bone are the result of trauma, and did that trauma occur around the time that they died, or are those defects the result of the environmental process? Is it something that happened potentially when they were buried, or environmental changes? It might be decades since the event has actually happened. And those same questions are the same questions that we're asked here in a coronial setting, but in a humanitarian context, it's just on a very different context, and it's just a larger scale.
Mm-hmm. So, Linda?
Where do I start? I don't know. I think that the first one is timeframes. Everything's over and done with nicely in 45 minutes on television or whatever, which I get that you need to do that, but in reality, it takes a lot longer for us to complete our reports, but it does create slightly unrealistic expectations. I mean, you do the autopsy, and then, you process the histology, and the toxicology takes time. If it needs neuropath, it's going to take 6 months, because that's my backlog. But also then we have the quality controls and checks and things, so things actually do take a lot longer than they do in fiction. And I guess the other thing is a time of death thing, which I sit directly opposite our family health nurses who speak to families on a daily basis, answering their questions around cause of death and process. And the number one question they get asked about 5 times a day is around time of death. I know the response wrote now. We really are very bad at it, but there's this expectation that's not the case. So that has ramifications beyond fiction. It's families have expectations, and they really want to know and we really often can't tell them. And very rarely we can. With the increase of wearables and bits and pieces these days, that can be helpful. But generally speaking, we can't give that information anywhere near the precision that you see that's fictionalised.
And so I'm guessing that from that basis that the certainty of television is something that really irritates you.
Yeah, and it's not just forensic pathology. We don't say who did it. Mm. We just try and say what happened. Mm. But in terms of saying the what happened, that might implicate a who person, and so that's why timing issues are really important. And we get asked about this a lot in court in terms of timing of injuries and things. And in reality, we just can't do it with very much precision at all. And so I often stand up in court and say, could be 2 hours, could be 2 days, and that's inevitably disappointing to people who would like us to be more precise, but that is unfortunately the reality, that's the limitation of the science. So. Mm-hmm.
Yes, court is something I also wanted to ask all of you about. I know some forensic specialists have actually done law degrees just because they were so traumatised is perhaps not the right word, but bewildered, annoyed, and they just wanted to, they did law so they could figure out what kind of questions might be coming and what was the mindset behind them. So can you each tell me about a time in court that perhaps you would rather have not had? Or a time when it was a triumph?
Look, each court appearance is different, and I quite like, the one thing I don't like about court is the uncertainty of when you're going to appear. So the fact that you're on standby for an appearance that maybe doesn't happen that day and maybe doesn't happen at all, or could be put over to next week, or you might just get on the stand at the end of the day and then you've got to come back again and finish it off for 10 minutes the next day. So that's the, I think what we all find, the chaos, which it's the way the system has to be. It's a huge thing to run a trial, and it's very important that they sequence it the way that they need to, and it's quite unpredictable. But that can sometimes be difficult. Once you're in court, it's always a surprise, actually, what you are asked, and it's never what you think you're going to get asked. And sometimes, actually, I'm just thinking about the best times I've had in court have been when you've got a very well-informed barrister who is asking really interesting, incisive questions. And I do remember one time in the county court that the barrister actually he was so well informed that he got quite carried away asking me a lot of general entomology questions, and he was having a blast, and he started getting into embryology, and he was wanting to know all this and this, and it was a lovely conversation, actually, but I started to get into the details, and it got shut down quite quickly by the judge. I mean, there have been, and when I think about a time that I did not like in court, it was actually as a pathologist, where I was certainly moved to really reflect on it afterwards, where I actually got accused of being biased, and it was done in such an artful way by the barrister involved, and it wasn't true. I was not biased, but he made it sound like I was colluding with the police in the way that he asked the question. I felt like I really fell into a trap, and I've since gotten a lot better at thrusting back a little bit, and that's not to say that being aggressive, because it's a terrible thing to lose control of your emotions in court, but I certainly learnt to get a lot firmer after that. So I think for us, one of the things that we do as a department that's really good is we try to take an observer along with us to court as often as we can, and it's in fact a requirement that we do that as much as possible. And it's nice to sometimes as well ask them afterwards for feedback on what you could do better, and for me it's possibly getting lost in long technical explanations and saying too much are the things that I need to work on.
Sam?
I think I also say a few times as well, so it's fair, Mel. There you go. For the part that's probably the most challenging is trying to understand where they're going with the questions, I think, because often you have your evidence and these are your findings, and you've spent a ridiculous amount of time preparing that and going through it and thinking about every single question that might relate to your report and your findings, and then they just ask questions that are completely left field of that. And there's obviously a reason for that, and you appreciate that there's a story on their side that they're trying to fit the evidence to, but you're not necessarily privy to that story. So sometimes it feels hard to understand the questions that are asked. Not necessarily that they're hard to answer, just why is this the topic that we're discussing? When for you as a scientist, you feel like the important things are something else. So that's probably the challenging part. I think one of the most sort of positive or rewarding parts is when you can see that the jury understands what you're saying. And people, well, hopefully you think so, they're nodding along, or they look like they're taking it in. And it sometimes can be incredibly difficult to communicate quite specialised findings, and especially for people who might have never heard of these types of disciplines before or had any involvement with this sort of area, and then you start to talk quite technical, anatomical terminology or trauma findings or taphonomy or something that can be quite hard to understand. And the skill, or the real skill for the expert, is to be able to communicate it in a way that everyone will understand. And I think that's something I keep trying to do better each time. But I really take a bit of positive feedback when it looks like it is, like the true meaning is coming across.
Linda?
Yeah, I can sympathise. Reading through your court transcript is an ultimate cringe. The amount of, you don't realise how many times you stutter and say, because they transcribe every single expression, and it's quite cringeworthy. I just reiterate what Sam said, it's not your narrative, and you don't know necessarily, and quite appropriately, what's being run, and you've done all this work and you understand your evidence, and then you get asked questions which aren't even necessarily anything to do with that, and you just, you can only reply to the questions that you're asked, and sometimes you just walk away going, what was that about? So you can't always predict what the issues are going to be. In terms of the court is slowly evolving in terms of the way we present evidence. So we give a lot more. There's a lot more visual aids these days, and I think that's really helpful in the court setting to explain particularly complex medical issues to juries. In terms of the adversarial nature, I guess I've had some very aggressive questioning in the past, not necessarily just, I do opinions and I appear for defence in appeal cases and bits and pieces, so I've had, occasional very aggressive questioning, and, I think it never seems to be particularly effective to me. I think the most effective the most effective questioning is they just sort of gently take you by the hand and slowly lead you to where they want to go. If someone's really trying to have a red hot go at me, I'm going to bring it on, because if you're having a go at me and not my evidence, I'm okay with that, and it's never a good look anyway, I don't think. And I think that sort of old Rumpole style is, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that's becoming hopefully a dying art, shall we say, because I really don't think it's particularly effective. I don't know whether, Audrey, you have a view about that.
Yes, there's one forensic scientist of my acquaintance who was in court, and the defence barrister started asking her what subjects she did in first year of her course, and she had to go through all those, and then what she did in the second year and what she did in the third year, and the whole point of the exercise was to point out to the jury, supposedly, that she had a very poor memory because she couldn't remember things, and it just went on, and apparently she wasn't allowed to speak to her instructor during the lunch break because that's the rules, but at the end of the day she said, "Why didn't you rescue me?" And he said, well, I could see that the jury was thinking that this guy is an absolute idiot, and it was actually better for the case. So she was just part of the courtroom theatre, and it was actually serving a completely different end. It was nothing to do with what she had to say with the court. It was just part of the larger plan, which she found kind of humbling but interesting. So now I'd like, actually, because we all, any of us who watch TV or even read books about forensics, we never get the actual nitty-gritty, probably because it's might be a bit boring for some readers, but it's actually hard to explain. So just if you tell the audience, Mel, in your forensic entomology life, what happens if you're called to a scene and there's a locked door and there's, say, the dead body of a mother and a child there, and nobody knows when they were last seen? What can you do? Because you're asked to find out how long have they been dead.
So as an entomologist, you'd get there a long way down the track after the scene had been largely processed by crime scene, so the door would be unlocked. But actually, I would say if you were a first responder on such a scene, and even as the forensic pathologist, one of the things about two people dead at a scene, there's a few different possible explanations. And one, of course, is murder, and another could be that one has died and been a caregiver for a dependent one who has been unable to seek help. And another explanation, though, that we always have to think about is scene safety, and that could be that there's a noxious gas, and carbon monoxide would be your leading possibility in the domestic setting. So actually one of the first things that they might do at the scene of a double fatality is hopefully clear the scene for safety. So and there are quite a few different points of scene safety that we always have to consider actually when we're working at a crime scene. But and I've nearly fallen down a cliff, and I've nearly stuck my finger on a knife. I mean, you really actually can hurt yourself quite badly at a crime scene. So that's your first thing. But let's put all that aside and just go purely with the entomology. So the question might be, did they die at the same time, or have they actually died at different times? And if you're bringing that scenario of a mother and daughter, then the caregiver and helpless one would probably be your leading, if it's a young child, your leading possibility for causing the death. It could also be a murder-suicide for all we know, but you definitely would want to establish a time of death as best you can for them. So if they were somewhat decomposed, the entomologist might be called, and what you'd be looking for is a difference in the development stage of the insects on the two bodies. And I would certainly be upfront and say that sometimes it can be, even in the same scene with people who are known to have died at the same time, actually you can have different colonisation times for those two bodies. And one explanation for that could be that the flies have taken a while to get into a house, and there's only a few flies able to get in, so they've colonised, say, one body, and then a few more flies get in and colonise the other. So that's certainly a thing that can happen. But let's just say that, in fact, the two of them have died at some distance of time apart. And what you'd be interested in doing then is making sure that you take a collection of insects from both bodies and then the surrounds as well. So at a scene, we're actually more interested in the surroundings than we are in the body. And the reason for that is twofold. So number one, as an entomologist, and as a pathologist too, as in anything at a scene, you've got to be very respectful of what you touch, where you walk, etc. And one of the absolute no-nos is to interfere unnecessarily with the body, because you can interrupt trace, you can distort injuries. There are so many reasons to not touch the body any more than you need to. So whilst you'll have a look, you'll be focused on the surroundings. And now the other reason the entomologist is really interested in the surroundings is that when the insects are finished feeding on a body, they leave the body, and the maggots anyway will crawl away. When they've finished feeding, they're ready to actually transform to the adult. So they crawl away from the body and they find a spot to hide, and then they undergo that transformation to the adult. So they do what's called pupate, and it's just the same as a butterfly with a chrysalis. And so when you're at a scene, you want to make a complete collection. You can take all of the insects on the body at the mortuary at the appropriate time when the pathologist has finished doing what they're doing, and you can look deeper under the clothing and under better light at the mortuary. So you can cover the body side of things best at the mortuary, but the scene side of things you need to be aware of making sure that you collect all those life history stages that have left the body, because they'll actually potentially be the oldest life history stage, and thus very important for working out how long that body has been colonised by insects. So what you would do is make a very careful search, and if you're in a house, actually, you would be looking potentially in cupboards and under carpet and in detritus if there's stuff all over the floor, just trying to make sure that you find all those little hiding maggots or pupae, and potentially even remnants left by dead insects that have been feeding on the body at some time in the past. So you do that, you take all of that back to the lab and you process it. And what you're looking for is a difference in the ages of the insects on the body to maybe tell you that there's been a difference in the time that they've died, or maybe you're looking at the same profile. So in the case of a mother and daughter, you might expect some fairly well-developed maggots on the mother, and then the daughter may have survived for some time before succumbing, and then you might find either there's no colonisation at all or there's very young maggots, and that can lead you to infer that there's some evidence at least of a gap in the time between their deaths, which can help to support that scenario of death of a caregiver and death of a dependent.
There's also a lot of other maths to do, isn't there, about working out how long the life cycles have taken, because that can vary, can't it, according to the temperature and the breed and the
species.
Yeah. So could you share some of that complexity with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we talk about species because breeds are artificial, human-created things like German shepherds and Siamese cats, but species are the cat and the dog. And when we talk about flies, we're talking about the species. And so, as you say, exactly, the different species have different growth rates, and there's different sets of laboratory data even describing sometimes the growth rates in different populations. So flies in England of a certain species that's cosmopolitan, so found around the world, may be different to the growth rate of the ones in Australia. So you've got to be quite careful sometimes about which growth rate data you use. So when you actually try to work out how old old those maggots are. What you want as well is an idea of the prevailing temperature, and of course you would think the first place you'd go for that would be the nearest weather station, but the problem is, of course, if you've got these bodies in a house, let's just say the heating's not on. If the heating's on, that's great, and you know it was on the whole time, well, you've got a nice constant temperature, happy days. But very rarely is that the case. So in fact, what you have to do is put down a data logger that will collect the temperatures at the scene for some time after the bodies are left, usually a minimum of 2 to 3 days, but 10 days is really good. And then you will actually make a correlation with the temperatures measured by the nearest weather station, and that will allow you to produce an equation that will help you to correct the temperatures, so you can get an estimate of what things were like when the bodies were in situ, and that will help you to understand what temperatures those maggots grew under.
And have you ever had to breed insects yourself to figure out what had happened and observe their cycle?
Occasionally. Actually, the main reason that you would do that, so one of the things that you would do when you're processing the insect evidence would be to rear a live sample to adulthood, and the reason is that the younger they are, the more difficult they are to identify to species, and so we would rear a subsection of them in the sample just to make sure that we get our species identification correct. That's the main reason why you would do that. Occasionally you'll actually rear these species in the lab to get more data about how quickly they grow at various temperatures, but on a particular case you'd be doing it for that reason, to make a species ID.
And all the time people are saying, why is it taking so long? Yes. Sam, can you take us through a sort of a practical, what you'd be doing in having to investigate a body or some bones or...
Yes, so I guess there's a whole range of different types of scenarios you might have, but say we had an individual out in the bush, so skeletal remains might be found in the bush. That process would typically involve the anthropologist going to the scene to collect those remains. So even if remains are often on the surface, sometimes it can still be difficult to make sure that every single bone has been collected, which is why it's always good for the anthropologist to go. If those remains were actually buried in the bush, then it would be following sort of that standard archaeology process. So most anthropologists have at least some skills in archaeology. Many have quite a lot of skills in archaeology. So following that process about how to appropriately excavate, document the excavation process is really quite an integral part, and obviously always with the police. So it is always their scene, but the anthropologist is there to help with that recovery process. So if we went through that process and we recovered the remains, and if we took them into the mortuary, it would then be an anthropology examination, and that's still always in consultation with the forensic pathologist, because it is still, of course, the forensic pathologist's case, and so the autopsy is done most of the time together. If the remains are skeletonized, then it would be done together, and the anthropologist will then look at a number of different features on the bones to answer a range of different questions. So if we already have an idea on who the person is, so if we already have a believed to be identity, then I wouldn't do a biological profile. So I wouldn't estimate sex, age, ancestry. I would look at the appropriate samples for a scientific method of identification, whether that would be fingerprints, but unlikely if the remains are skeletonized, or go to DNA, or perhaps if there's a dentition, look at forensic odontology. So we would sort of triage that identification process very early on, and then the questions that really come down for the anthropologist would be questions around the preservation of the remains, and are the changes that we see in the bone essentially then the result of the environment and being out in bushland, or are they the result of trauma, and at what point did that trauma occur? So that examination process is mostly morphological, like we're physically looking at the remains. We don't have a whole range of very fancy scientific equipment. It's normally just in the brain what types of methods that we're using and looking at, and that examination would be done together with the pathologist. But
for an anthropologist, you can tell the difference between a bone that's just been aged by wear and tear, attacked by animals and stuff, and someone who's been the victim of violence.
Yes. So our categories, if you will, we have antemortem trauma, so something that's occurred before an individual's died and there's evidence of healing. We've got perimortem trauma, so that's something that's happened to an individual around the time that they died. Could have happened just before, could have happened at the exact moment that they died, and it could have happened after they died, essentially until their bones have essentially dried out. So our bones are still fresh and organic at the time that we die, but once our bones have dried out, they respond very differently to environmental changes. So you can tell a fracture that has occurred when a bone is dried out versus a fracture that has occurred when the bone is still essentially wet, so roughly around the time that they died.
So Linda, what can you tell us about what your job actually looks like with someone watching you at work?
Goodness. I spend... I do a lot of managerial stuff these days, which is a little bit dull. I guess I spend most of my operational time doing neuropathological examinations, so brain examinations. So, we're fortunate enough now to have the CT, and we're getting MRI next year, which is really exciting. But it really sort of starts out... Now that we have this tool, from my point of view, no forensic neuropath examination is complete without actually, reviewing the imaging before you start, and then, doing the brain examination, but with bearing in mind the questions that need to be addressed for that particular case, because it's not a case of just examine this brain and write a report, because the brain is such a complex organ, and depending on, this is why context is actually important, depending on the questions that are being asked, my examination will have to incorporate different things. So, so I spend a fair bit of time doing the brain examinations, and then obviously the histology, so the work under the microscope afterwards, and that actually, from a neuropath point of view, can be the most time-consuming thing to do. So it's not particularly exciting, but I find it rewarding.
But you've done, I gather, quite a lot of work on shaken baby syndrome. Could you tell us a bit about that?
My unfavourite expression. So shaken baby syndrome is not a term that I would use. It implies a level of certainty about a mechanism of injury that we can't have. Look, it is a very difficult and challenging area, and it's quite emotive for people. I don't know what else to say about that. So I certainly don't use the term, and it's not from a diagnostic point of view used. In the clinical world, they use the term abusive head trauma. I don't like to use that because, to me, that implies it's slightly pejorative. I use inflicted head injury because I think the abusive, but that's my preference. Mm-hmm. But yes. A good number of years ago now, that term went out of usage, again acknowledging the lack of certainty about the specifics and mechanism of injury in a particular case.
And how about, and you also do quite a lot of work on CTE. Can you tell us a bit about that and how it's changed?
Yeah, the CTE work is really, really challenging because a CTE examination is very labour intensive. And when you think about the symptoms of CTE, they're very non-specific. And, unfortunately, we see, I can't remember the figure. I think it's maybe 60 suicides a month in Victoria. I could have the numbers wrong, but it's a really, really big problem. And we certainly don't autopsy all of those cases. It's very, the families don't want it, and it's not practical, particularly when the circumstances are very clear, someone that they've taken their own life. And so not only do we not autopsy all of those cases, but we certainly don't do the extensive brain examination that's required to diagnose CTE. It's a very in-depth and complex examination. So we really need to have a strong indication beforehand that person might have been suffering from CTE, and the symptoms are very non-specific. So, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So if we can get a history of repeated head trauma, often involved in sport, and what is really helpful, I think, is there's an increased awareness in the community around CTE. So we've had cases where the police have actually told us, they've rung us up afterward, they've found someone who's taken their lives and say, you know, Joe Bloggs, he played a lot of country football and he had lots and lots of head knocks. And so there's this growing awareness that people kind of raise it up the flagpole so we can do the right examination, because there's just no way that we could do that examination for everyone who takes their own life, and it wouldn't be acceptable, to the community either. So it is really useful for us to know beforehand that people are concerned about that, so that we can do the right examination, because it's very, very labour intensive, and often, if we're serious, it involves sending the brain to Sydney, and that is not what a lot of families want. So we've developed, I guess, a series of protocols that if families raise a concern about CTE, depending on how their wishes and the likelihood, we'll either, with their consent, send the brain to the Australian Sports Brain Bank for diagnosis, or we will do the examination here and take all the samples and send them up to Sydney. It's not an easy diagnosis to make, because there's other complex neurodegenerative processes that can overlay that. So I think it's really good that there's a centre like the ASBB that has expertise in this condition, and also doesn't overdiagnose the condition, because I think some of the controversies that initially sat around it was the misdiagnosis of some of the glial pathology that you see that isn't CTE, but has been so it's been overcalled in the past. I guess the other part from a neuropathology point of view that I find I guess the most challenging are we call them one punch. The coward's punch, I guess, is the colloquial. I understand the reason for using that terminology, because one punch sounds kind of heroic. It's like King. But yes, just seeing these cases and seeing the futility, when I go to court, I'd see the grieving family, and then I see the accused person and their lives wrecked and their families. It's just such a tragedy from such a stupid moment in time. And their brains are just a mess as well. It's their bodies are fine, they're fit and healthy, and then they just have a catastrophic head injury, and it's such a waste, and it's so tragic. So it is challenging, and I think some of the work that's hopefully the public education around the sort of one punch thing is hopefully having an effect, because you see on television all this stylized violence where people can get beat up and get up and they're all fine. We break very easily, so I really hope that education gets out there.
So is this the kind of work that you thought when you first decided that you wanted to be a forensic pathologist? Is this what you thought you would be doing? What did you think you'd be doing? Gosh,
I said what really attracted me to the discipline was sort of more the medical problem-solving side. And yes, you're right. I guess my professional journey has evolved. I've had the opportunity to do work in lots of interesting places in the Pacific, and just to meet some extraordinary people. That's what I love about my job, is that it's very collaborative. People think that pathologists like to kind of work in sort of, deep dark dungeons and don't like to talk to people. It's a really rewarding job, because you get to work with people who are very passionate and really just want to get the best outcomes for families and things. And it's really privileged with working with people like that.
So, Sam, what did you think when you first decided to train as a forensic anthropologist? What did you think you'd be doing?
So I didn't decide to sort of head down the forensic anthropology path until I got to a PhD level. So it wasn't what I set out to do when I first started studying or was interested in anthropology. But when I sort of chose this path at the PhD point, it probably is actually. It's very much, these are the types of things or the types of questions that I thought it would be about. I also do a lot of work in human identification, so it's not as so much anthropology based, but it's all very important work work that we do within the coroner's system. So I love all the aspects of the work that I do. And the anthropology work itself is very much what I had hoped forensic anthropology would be.
Now, Mel, I know you were a lover of insects long before you probably even got to uni. Could you tell the audience about your insects and the things your father, the tank your father built for I forgot what the insects were now. Praying mantises, something?
Well, probably.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Maybe that was my stick insects.
Yes, your stick insects.
Yes.
Tell the audience about
I
your
just
stick.
found that in the roof
You
of my
conned me to
parents'
letting you
house.
have one in your office just
Yes, I
recently.
just got another stick insect after a 10-year hiatus. We just got that cage that Dad built me for my stick insect collection from the roof of the house the other day, my brother and I, because I've got stick insects again. Yes, I always did love them, and I did some voluntary work actually at Museum Victoria when I was a teenager, and I think, back in those days you could actually do those kinds of things, and I was about 13 years old and working in the invertebrate survey department and in the entomology collection, and ultimately did get a few jobs there over summer and afterwards as well, and that's where I learnt the backbone of my entomology. And so for me, I think I was lucky to be born in the right time. It's a lot harder, I think, now, especially as a kid, to get behind the scenes, whereas if you were diligent and hardworking, they would have me sitting at the bench sorting insects from their surveys or mending them in the collection when they had to move to the new museum. I was out there with my glue and trying to get the old verdigris pins from a time when the museum had bought some cheap pins that had too much brass in them, and then they got verdigris that was breaking the specimens apart. So that was my job, and pinning up broken legs and gluing them together for a little while.
Now, we're getting the wind up here, so just one quick last question I've got time for. Is there any piece of fiction or television or film that any of you would recommend that gives a half accurate portrayal of what you do?
No, but I love Deadlock. That was hilarious.
I think I'd also have to say no. Sorry, there's nothing I could recommend that was true forensic anthropology.
No.
Okay. So we now have to move to the part of the evening which is to do with your questions. So you need to put your hand up if you have a question to ask, and so Lindy will bring the mic to you. Someone else will bring the mic to you. And the mic? And please also give your name before you speak, so that Sarah Hood can judge the best question. We are being recorded for Radio National, but they will have time to cut it out if you don't want it.
My name is Chris, and I'd like to follow on your last question. Which of the TV series or movies that you've seen would you think are the worst?
I'd have to say Silent Witness, because look, back in the day, like when Amanda Burton was on it, I thought it was actually not too bad. And also, I worked in Glasgow a good while ago, and the lady who inspired Amanda Burton's character is from Glasgow, and she is a scream. So I have some affection for that show initially, but yeah, I think we were talking before, as it's gone on, some things should end because it's just becoming more and more crazy.
But she still did a bit of skulking around crime scenes at night on her own.
She never looked very happy. Maybe that is accurate, I don't know.
No.
Well, how ridiculous is that? And when we asked, Kathy Rikes about it, she just went, "Oh, sorry. You'll have to cut this out." When we asked Kathy Rikes about how come Tempe Brennan was wearing a gun, she did this little movie.
So, next question.
Hi. Is that with you? Hi, my name's Philomena. I did my PhD in autopsy, so I've seen the incredible value that they provide and the answers they give. And I was doing it around the time when they revised the Coronial Act so that there was much more respect given to families, which I think was really important given some of the previous body retention scandals that had occurred. I guess my question is around death scenes, whether they're car accidents, bus accidents, where there's death. One of the things I hear from families is what they feel is a lack of respect when bodies are left there for 6, 12, 24 hours. They feel there's respect at Forensic Institute, like VIFM, but they feel that in-between space can be really disrespectful when bodies are left on roads or on buses and so on. So I'm just wondering if you could kind of explain why that might be the case, given, you know, sometimes there's a sense of why isn't it urgent to get them to the refrigeration and preserve and all those kinds of things?
Do you want to? I'll feel my way awkwardly through that question. I guess it depends on the scenario that you're talking about, because if it is a suspicious death, then you've got to balance the processing the scene, and that takes time, and you only get to do it once, and all of those things. I guess there are also other issues in terms of public safety and safety of first responders and all of those things. So it's not my experience that deceased people are left in situ any longer than they need to be, given those factors. But there may be examples that I'm not aware of. But I do know that scene processing can take a long time, and that can be difficult for people. But the scene also has to be made safe. Particularly, I think there's been some scenarios where there's been contamination of the scene, and it's actually been hazardous, and the only thing that's going to decontaminate the scene is time, and that's really unfortunate when there's a situation like that.
Hello, my name's Karina. I'm a crime writer, and Linda, I just wanted to say, unlike pathologists, crime writers like deep, dark caves to work in. Thank you very much for all the comments today. I'm really interested in how each of you in your individual discipline would approach, major identification and autopsy findings for something like the war in Gaza, where there's tens of thousands of bodies, probably, and body parts. How would you approach that? How would you identify those people and their causes of death?
I'll take that one. So that scale is obviously enormous, and that situation has happened in many parts of the world where we have a large number of individuals that are very quickly no longer identified. And that process for identification does not happen overnight, and that it would essentially require the setup of a formal identification system where the relevant identification data is collected from each of those deceased individuals, and that there is a huge amount of work done to collect the relevant ante-mortem data. So data that's reference data from families, for example, like reference DNA samples. So the collection of that ante-mortem data and the collection of that post-mortem data will take years, if not decades, to do properly. But that is the only way that you can scientifically identify every individual in those types of situations. So it's a long process.
Yeah, I just will add to that, in terms of the ICRC, they have sort of guidelines, particularly for under-resourced countries about what to do in those situations, and really it is take a DNA sample and bury the person, and then be prepared for that very, very long process, because that's what needs to happen when you're just dealing at things at such a scale.
Hi, my name's Bronwyn, and I apologise for the abrupt change of tone, but I've got a much lighter question. We've spoken about what you don't like about crime procedurals, but keeping in mind that having crime fiction and also crime procedurals on television can really inspire more generations of women to get into scientific procedures. In your ideal crime drama, how would you like to see yourself cast? Who's your dream casting for yourself?
You haven't answered the question for a while, Melanie.
Just think of the most boring person in Hollywood, and that will be. Honestly, I am so boring and nerdy that it would be really hard to spice me up. You'd have to make me into somebody else entirely.
Oh, we all give an answer. Oh, all of us. I have never thought about that, ever. And now I'm trying very hard to think of who would maybe suit my personality for an anthropologist. I honestly have no idea. Linda, do you have any ideas? And I'll keep thinking. Who could?
I'm sorry, pass.
Bronwyn, I'll think about it and get back to you afterwards.
My name's Owen, and I've got a question for Mel. It seems like flies are the insect group most of interest to you, and I'm wondering, first part of the question, are there any other invertebrate groups that are of use to you? And amongst the flies, is it just a few groups of flies, or is it lots? Just some indication of what numbers of insects you're looking at.
Yes, so the first part of the question, it's not just flies actually, so it's also beetles would be the second most interesting group, but the reason that we focus so much on the flies is that they're usually the first colonisers, and of that, it's only a subset of the fly species that would attend a decomposing body that actually arrive first. There's actually a whole host of them that arrive throughout the decomposition process. And in fact, as well, as you've hinted at, there's a lot more species of flies than there are carrion flies. So they're actually only even, if I was to narrow it down for you and say, if we looked at all the flies in entirety, there's only a small number of families of those flies, because they're split into different families that associate with dead bodies, and even of those families that associate, there's only a small number of species. So even if we were to take the blowflies, so let's take the most common example, it's only a few species of blowfly actually that breed in carrion, and in fact the rest of them will be mainly obscure little parasites on slugs and snails, and they may breed in detritus, rotting organic matter. There's a whole lot of different lifestyles for these species, and carrion is just one of them. And sometimes for the common species, they're what we call facultative, so it could be that carrion is just one way that they can live their life, or they may do something else, and an example of that might be some flies that can actually breed in wounds. So anybody who's from the country might know about sheep strike, and so you would know that you can actually get, there's a couple of nods, so you can actually get infestation, especially around the back end of sheep, and that will be a blowfly or a series of different blowfly species, but we can also find those on dead bodies. So they can flip-flop and do different things depending on what's available to them sometimes. Yeah.
I love the joy in your face when you talk about flies.
So interesting.
Hi, this is Jenny. I'm just wondering what's the most bizarre or unusual item or scenario you might have come across in your career. I'm just thinking of the classic textbook Bailey in Love, where there's a picture of a pepper pot that was retrieved from someone's rectum with the greetings from Margate inscribed on it.
No, I'm not going there. I'm sorry.
Hi, Kerry Ann Sullivan. Just wanted you to touch on one facet I don't think you have tonight. If you have, it was probably when I nodded off, and I'm sorry. I'm very tired. But bodies that have been in the water a long time, how do you get a time of death from those? And when there is increased decomposition, how accurate can that be? And what's the process for bodies that have been in the water for a long period of time?
There's someone in the audience who's done a PhD on this. Maybe you should talk to her afterwards. Sorry, Gemma, drop you right in it there.
Here's one of my collaborators.
Oh, well past. I wanted the roving microphone to go to you. No, she really, truly is an expert. And it's very difficult in the early stages because you've got decomposition changes that are very variable depending on even where the body's been in the water column, let alone what kind of water it's been in. And there are a lot of different facets to that. As the body gets out later from the proposed time of death, you may, and I mean people have used things like, or tried to use things like colonisation of barnacles and various weeds and things, seaweeds that the body may pick up as it floats through. And I think, would it be fair to say, Jem, that that's not been very successful? She's nodding. And it's not something we would routinely do either. And one of the most useful things, I suppose, to take home from all of the really excellent research that's been done in this area is actually to understand that it's really variable and you can't be accurate. So sometimes the no answer and the limitations are the most valuable thing that can come out of the research that people do. But yeah, do you have anything to add, Jem? It's a pity you don't have a microphone. You're the expert.
No, I think you answered excellently. The only thing I would add that one of the tricky things about that environment is that it's three-dimensional compared to a body that's recovered from land, which is essentially doesn't necessarily move. It may do after death, but a body in water has the ability to move in three-dimensional space, and that presents a large number of variables, as Mel has mentioned, that aren't necessarily relevant for bodies that are recovered terrestrially on land. And it means that the factors that affect a body are incredibly varied. And so there may be a number of factors that we aren't even aware of that the body has been subjected to when it's been in the water. So there's often very little that we can actually say about where a body went into the water, what has happened to it whilst it has been in the water, and for how long it may have been there. It is incredibly difficult to say with even any remote level of certainty anything about bodies that are recovered from water. We're still doing research now to try to better approximate what and when and how and why.
We've probably got time for one more question, I think.
My name's Matthew. I had a question on when in the beginning you briefly touched on piecing together like skeletons as like a puzzle. I wanted to ask, how often do you do this in your job, and mostly under what circumstances does this occur?
So, sorry, just to check, as in piecing a single bone back together, or as in laying out a skeleton to analyse? Piecing a single bone. Piecing a bone back together. So in any case where we have trauma, that will be done. And in some cases where there's a lot of taphonomic changes, so environmental changes, like for example burning, you might have lots of fragments. In any case like that where we're not sure exactly what's happened and we need to understand, we'll piece it back together. So basically trauma or environmental change.
Sorry, I had a follow-up question. These small fragments that are more difficult to piece together, how do you identify them, like differentiate them, like bone from bone? Especially with
bone from not bone, or which part of the bone?
Like both also. Like
yeah, well, it comes down to the osteology. So like a really good understanding of the anatomy of the bone. We know what bone looks like in humans, and that looks different to non-human species. So if we're trying to say if a bone is human or not human, And then if we're trying to piece together a human bone again, we know that there's all different types of anatomical landmarks on the bone, and we know where we should see those landmarks. So we can lay it out in generally the anatomical position, and then we start to piece them back together that way.
Okay, I think now it's time to ask Sarah to judge the best question.
I've got a follow-up question. A follow-up question, Carl. I just want to know how you glue them back together. What do you use?
So there are a whole range of different implements you can use. I like to use a glue that is dissolvable. So because not necessarily, you're not always guaranteed to have the exact two pieces right the first time, and you want to be able to re-alter and keep shifting. So I use a dissolvable glue.
So you don't use super glue?
No. No super glue.
Okay. Now I think look, no one could accuse this audience of not wanting to get into the nitty-gritty. Okay, so Sarah's going to choose the best question.
I'm going to give the prize to the one answer that involved audience participation. So, Carrie-Anne, your question about bodies in the water was a great question. Got some great response from here, but also brought audience participation. So, you get the prize.
Well, thank you for that. I would like you to thank the panel, Professor Linda Iles on the far left again, Dr. Samantha Rowbotham in the middle, and Dr. Melanie Archer.